Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. Your co-host Scott Parkin on the shores of the great San Francisco Bay, as you can tell from the scene behind me. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko. And when you think of waterfront, you think of Houston, Texas, right? And so that's where we're at today. And also, may I point out that we are commemorating the anniversary today of Karl Marx's death.
Oh, there you go.
1883, March 14th, 1883, Marx died, buried at Highgate Cemetery in London. And despite every effort by the ruling class for centuries to destroy his legacy, he's still around. And we're still reading him and talking about it.
And he still has great influence on many of us. Today, we are going to be talking about a very much discussed topic that's been in the news this week, which is state repression. There's a lot going on with the Trump administration, with his cronies in both the administration and outside of the administration, targeting people who talk back, fight back, speak up, campaign, do civil disobedience, and many other things. And so we're going to be talking about that today. We'll both be talking about a history of state repression, probably for the last 100, 200 years. And then we'll also be talking about some of the more current events. What has sparked this conversation today is what has happened with Mahmoud Khalil, who is a permanent resident of the United States. I believe he was an Algerian citizen of Palestinian descent. He was a Columbia grad student. He had finished a degree at Columbia in May. He was actually a top negotiator for the student encampments, which happened last spring at Columbia. And then on Saturday, he was picked up by ICE, who didn't even know he was a permanent resident. They thought he was on a student visa, because it shows you how competent those people are. His wife, I believe he was snatched in front of his 8-month pregnant wife. He's been held down in Louisiana to separate him from his legal support team and from his family. And it has led to a huge outburst of activity all over the country. Universities are walking out. University students are walking out everywhere. They had a massive civil disobedience sit-in at Trump Tower, where Jewish Voices for Peace had 100 people arrested occupying Trump Tower, demanding his release. Many other things as well.
Isn't that the irony of that all, right? You arrest 100 Jewish students for defending somebody who's been accused of anti-Semitism, and then they get accused of anti-Semitism for defending this guy's rights against the country committing a genocide. So that's where we are today.
And Zionist groups were putting out on social media to stay away from Trump Tower when that sit-in was happening because it wasn't safe for Jews.
It's never safe, right?
It wasn't safe for Jews because the NYPD was in there arresting a bunch of them is why.
I mean, saying the words free Palestine must be incredibly traumatic. That will kill you, right? So anyway.
Feelings. What can I don't know what to do about all these hurt feelings.
Trump is genuinely like deranged and sociopathic and cruel and anything you want to say. But I think it's important to understand too, there's a much bigger context of this. And many of the process under which Mahmoud Khalil was whisked away was created by Obama and Biden as well. And I think that's important to understand. This is a really long-term and really deeply rooted American tradition, this kind of repression, often associated with crises abroad. Today, we're seeing this with regard to, even before, obviously Israel and Palestine, even before that, Ukraine and Russia, where you were Putin's bitch if you disagreed with it. And there were people getting canceled even then, nothing like what we're seeing today, where the First Amendment's being tossed out. But I thought it'd be useful to talk, I'll try to be brief with some of the history of this, because what we're seeing today is really a mirror of many other periods in U.S. history. The first one I could think of, and it's useful because it does fit into what we're going through today, occurred in the late 18th century, literally like 1798 to 1800. And like today, that involved domestic politics. There was what was called a quasi-war. The British and the French were involved in a trade war, and they were attacking neutral shipping, meaning the Americans. So the U.S. sent envoys to Europe to discuss this. They were going to meet with the French government, but instead, 3 secret agents, codenamed X, Y, and Z, met the Americans and demanded a bride. And they came home, and that created this furor about France. Now, that was also connected to domestic politics in the U.S. The Federalist Party, the party like Hamilton and Adams, were pro-British, and the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, Madison, were pro-French. And so after the XYZ affair, this anti-French furor occurred all over the United States. And they said, we're not going to give them a bride, millions for defense, not one penny for tribute. But the important part of this, I think, is that Congress then passed two laws that were really critical and speak a lot to what we're going to do today. The Alien and the Sedition Act. And these were in 1798, I believe. The Alien Act was aimed at new people coming in the country. Sounds familiar. At the time, after 5 years, you could become a naturalized citizen and you could vote. What the Alien Act was going to do was extend that period from 5 to 14 years because so many of the new people coming into the country were becoming Republican. So it's also a voter suppression measure as well. It allowed deportation of dangerous aliens during peacetime. Again, just leaves it open like that. The Sedition Act curtailed what people thought, what they said. Basically, you could be arrested for damaging the government's interest. In the election of 1798, a Republican candidate was actually giving a campaign speech and was snatched down from the soapbox and arrested for criticizing John Adams, who was the Federalist running for president, right? That's what we're dealing with today. So this is rooted, it's embedded in the DNA of the United States. They weren't popular laws. They didn't stop the Republicans politically. Jefferson became president and they were, I think one lapsed and the other was repealed or something like that. But what we're going through today was already there. This is over 200 years ago. And that kind of stuff would continue. There were always exclusion acts and there were laws against political ideologies. In the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln actually suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which is the right, you have a constitutional right to be brought before a judge and be given a hearing on your charges, to be told that you're being formally charged with something. But Lincoln just simply suspended that, canceled. It's wartime, but still, you could see that happening. Then obviously, when we get to the 20th century, it becomes an even bigger deal, right? Even before the World War I era, you have labor agitators, and you're starting to see socialist and anarchist and groups like that. And so the government's going to take measures against them as well, right?
Yeah. And it's really important to note as we move into this period where we're seeing a lot of urban growth, industrial growth, and we're seeing a lot of immigration coming from Europe, where people have actually learned about socialist and anarchist politics. So we also start seeing people doing a lot more organizing. We start seeing a lot more labor radicalism. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show on William McKinley where we talked about a lot of agrarian radicalism that was happening in Midwestern states and Southern states. But what we see in the urban area around the same time period is this sort of like growth of unionism, people, socialists, anarchists. And we're also seeing a lot of what I would call street violence. We're seeing a lot of labor strife. What also happens with this increased immigration into the cities and the urban growth and the industrial growth is we're also seeing a lot of economic disparity, which is why people are organizing. And Haymarket is actually a pretty notable moment. The Pullman strike, many other strikes in this sort of period in the 1880s and 1890s, which are really important. And so the government actually, in the McKinley episode, we talk about how one of the ways the government sort of deals with things like that is that they look for wars abroad to go get involved in, but they also look for ways to crack down on those who are doing the agitating. And like immigrants are a pretty good target because it's much more at the behest of they're much more beholden to the government and to politicians.
Yeah, what I said earlier, I think needs to be emphasized. These repressions at home usually are connected to something bigger, usually some kind of global issue, like you just mentioned. And that's why I think on the left, you have to fight for justice here at home, equality, whatever. I call it class struggle, class conflict, class consciousness. But abroad, you have to be anti-imperialist. You have to. This isn't pick one or the other. You have to do both, I believe, because so much of that commitment abroad, both in terms of the focus, the political opportunities it creates, right? Whenever there's a war, you can attack people at home for being communists or terrorists or Muslims or whatever. And of course, the money spent on these foreign adventures, right? Look at what we're spending. You're looking just in Ukraine and Israel, nearly $500 billion in the last few years only. And that's money that's not obviously getting spent. In fact, we're being like just eviscerated right now. Social services, everything, perhaps Social Security, Medicare, right? But they're spending $500 billion on these things. So I think that's really,
it's just government efficiency, Bob. It's just inefficient. So we're trying to cut some costs here.
And so when that happens, you go after, like you pointed out, at Haymarket or any of these Pullman and the media. If you listen to if you read the media at the time, the language was actually pretty similar, right? Obviously, they said these people are foreigners, they're socialists, and one word they would use was terrorists. They're conducting terror, and they pointed out their foreign roots. They spoke German, or they were from Italy, or whatever. Right? So, no, it's very similar. And then I think what you really see is when World War I starts, is when it becomes really full blown in a lot of ways. Remember, Woodrow Wilson said it was a war to make the world safer democracy. And some people, a lot of people in the U.S., especially people who didn't actually enjoy democracy in the U.S., like African Americans or others, believed it. They said, "Oh, great, this is the war for democracy." Wilson didn't mean that. That's not what democracy meant to him. He created an institution immediately called the CPI, the Committee on Public Information. One of the kind of brains behind it was Edward Bernays, who we've talked about before, the father of mass marketing and propaganda and all that kind of stuff. And they conducted these really harsh propaganda campaigns, exactly like we're seeing now. Today, they're about Hamas, right? Hamas did that. Hamas did that. DEI did this. DEI and Hamas got together and did something or whatever. So again, that's not really new. At the time, the attacks were against like Germans. And so they would have these propaganda. Schools quit teaching German language, and symphonies didn't play German composers and silly stuff like that. The real guts of it. And again, this is relevant, I think, in fact, in the cases of Snowden and Assange. But Wilson also got Congress to pass two laws, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. Espionage Act 1917 criminalized words. And that's the important thing to remember in all of it. We're not talking about people who are throwing bombs or any of that stuff. We're talking about people who have different ideas, different thoughts, different words, and so forth, right? So the Espionage Act basically was used against people who they would accuse of helping the enemy. So basically people who were being pro-German, and quite often that would be German nationals in the United States. And then the Sedition Act a year later punished people for speaking and writing negatively about the war. And now this is the territory we're in again, right? And so it was these laws that really cracked down on any kind of different opinions. There was a clothes salesman in Vermont, I believe, who was talking to somebody around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. And he told his friend that he thought that he wasn't a communist. He didn't believe in it, but he said, you got to give credit to Vladimir Lenin. So he's really a smart guy, something like that. He's the brainiest guy, I don't know what he said. And the guy did 6 months in jail for saying basically that he thought Lenin was a smart guy. Obviously, the most famous victim of this is Eugene Debs. And we're all familiar with Debs' very famous speech in Canton, Ohio in 1918. He condemned the war in class terms. The master class declares all the wars. The subject class fights all the battles. When the speech ended, he was taken off the stage, arrested, convicted. The conviction was upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court. And he did 3 years before Warren Harding let him out. And that led directly to like the Red Scare. But the Debs thing, it was really, I play that in class, and everybody never read it or listened to it. There's a bunch of things on like YouTube where the actor like Mark Ruffalo reads the speech, right? And the thing, like I play it all the time. And one thing that I always stress afterwards is, what did Debs say? Did he encourage people to shoot Woodrow Wilson? Did he encourage people to throw bricks at the White House? He didn't do any of that. He said basically that the master class declares the warlord. And so this is what we're dealing with. And that's an point too, because you can see that today, right? From the river to the sea will get you into deeper trouble than actually subsidizing a real genocide.
Yeah.
So, and that's important stuff. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And as we're moving through this period, I think it's when people think about the Red Scare, they think about the 40s and 50s. They think about McCarthy, but the first Red Scare is in 1919, 1920, post-World War era, World War I era, where they're targeting Debs, they're targeting anarchists and socialists and the Wobblies and like lots of immigrants, lots of people are sent back. And so it's a pretty remarkable period, the way in which the state, as well as let's call them extrajudicial vigilantes who like are in support of the state, just declare war on all of these groups, like beat them, kill them, disappear them. It's a pretty amazing period, but a lot of people aren't familiar with.
And they did encourage those domestic vigilante groups, right? The KKK had a big resurgence. The KKK wasn't just about blacks. The KKK was about communists and Jews and all that kind of stuff. And,
Catholics.
Exactly. And this is the period when you see the Palmer raids, the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, deported 6,000 people. Again, just like Mahmoud Khalil, same thing. Palmer said that he demanded 100% Americanism, he called it. So you have the Palmer rage, and the thing is, so 6,000 people in a country at the time, I forget the US population, was over 100 million. And so 600,000 is not a huge amount, but what that did was essentially send word out to pretty much everybody, don't criticize the country, right? Don't criticize the United States, don't criticize Wilson. So it was pretty far reaching. Many people, many Italian anarchists or alleged Italian anarchists were deported. The most famous victims, objects of this were obviously Sacco and Vanzetti, who were framed on a murder charge in Massachusetts, very clearly did not do it, but they were well-known anarchists. And so that became a way for the government to say, see, these people, they have different ideas, they have a different language, they look differently, different than we do, and they're violent and they're threatening. And so again, what we're seeing today was really widespread at that first Red Scare. The first Red Scare also brought in African Americans. This is a period when you have a lot of racial rhetoric. Blacks thought when Wilson said, "There's a war to make the world safer democracy," thought that meant that, right? And obviously it didn't. Wilson was deeply racist. You have lynchings continue. You have kind of fights over public spaces. The Camp Logan riots in Houston, where the Houston police and Black soldiers in the U.S. Army actually went to war in the streets of Houston. Right? Wars again become the kind of precipitant for that. And right after, and the other part of this that's also important is like, this often happens too when there's a lot of problems going on and you need a distraction, you need a diversion. And so the period, especially when wars end, it's messy, right? You generally have these economic demobilizations. It's not unusual to have economic problems. You can have inflation, you can have deflation. Right after World War I, and remember too, keep in mind, you mentioned here, the Bolshevik Revolution is an important part of this, right? Because that like introduces communism to the world. And there were people in the U.S. who looked at that favorably. A lot of radical unions. There were radical unions in the U.S., like the Wobblies, but not just the Wobblies, right? And so this was perfect for A. Mitchell Palmer because he could point to that and say, J. Edgar Hoover, who was like in the Department of Justice at the time, said, he was very alarmist and hysterical, right? There is a point at which all of these groups are going to rise up at the same moment and overthrow the U.S. Everybody knows that's preposterous. There's no chance of that. There's a few thousand people maybe who even identify politically that way. And they're like devs for the most part, not violent or anything like that. But it kind of created this cachet. It's like today talking about this ferocious anti-Semitism like Biden called it. Same thing.
There's a great film, which we recommend. I think we've talked about it in some of our past film episodes, but it's called Reds. It's a Warren Beatty film, stars Warren Beatty, Diane Keaton. And there are segments of the movie where they actually show some of these attacks and raids by the state on unions and like radical organizations and immigrants and things like that. It's definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, it's great. This is also a period when there aren't federal immigration laws. I forget when the first, was it 1924, maybe the first immigration?
I think it was.
So before that, like when they say my parents came here the right way, all they did was show up. There weren't laws. I doubt when my grandparents came over, they went through Ellis Island, they were processed, but I don't think they had but there were immigration exclusion, like on the West Coast out, especially like in San Francisco, there were exclusionary laws passed, especially against Asians like Japanese and Chinese, because they were, again, the rhetoric was they're taking jobs away, and they created these kind of social things like they're eating dogs and cats. That was prevalent in the early 20th century, used against Japanese and Chinese in places like where you're living, right? So Trump is bringing this back 100-some years later. And
there was one in 1917 where they were trying to regulate the amount of Chinese coming in.
Yeah.
There's one in 1921 where they start trying to play with all immigration, but the big one is 1924.
Yeah.
It's the National Origins Quota Act.
Yeah. And then, and in the World War II era, you have Japanese camps set up. There was this threat, not a threat, the United States, this obsessive hysteria, right? There were about, I think, 150,000 Japanese living in Hawaii and about 100,000 elsewhere. I suspect the majority would have been in California. And when the war broke out, after Pearl Harbor, they were just corralled and put into these camps. Actually, Italian Americans had some, nowhere near the Japanese went through. So again, the idea is these are American citizens. Many of them fought and won medals of honor, actually fighting for the U.S. in World War II. But the basic idea there is if you are ethnically the same, if you're Japanese or if you're Italian, if you're German in World War I, then we can't trust you. And this is the assumption, right, is that if you're not like this, then you're like the DEI. The assumption there that the Republicans are telling us, that these people are telling us, is if you're Black or if you're a woman or if you're Mexican or whatever, and you got that job, you're inferior and you only got it. And so the assumption there is like you're inferior, right? And that's what goes into all this, right? So if you're Japanese, you're inferior. You can't be trusted. If you're Italian, you probably Mussolini. World War One, if you're German, you like the Kaiser.
And the Japanese internment really steps up after Pearl Harbor, after the sneak attack on December 7th.
And again, approved by the Supreme Court. And I mean, in general, I have a fairly, as presidents go, I have as positive a view of him as anybody. The president was who did this.
Trump?
Yeah.
Reagan.
In 1942 would have been Nixon.
Nixon, he rounded everybody up and put them in camps.
Yeah, no, it was FDR, liberal icon. FDR, approved by the Supreme Court. Tom Clark, who was the father of Ramsey Clark, a little bit of trivia if you're older and listening to this, in the Vietnam era, Ramsey Clark was briefly Attorney General. Ramsey Clark became a really hardcore, radical, anti-war activist later, but his dad was actually on the Supreme Court that affirmed the Japanese relocation. And that's something else that I think is really important nowadays to bring up, especially because we're told that everything is anti-Semitic. The United States had quotas on Jews. They did turn ships away. The St. Louis, it was in 1939. Jewish people were fleeing Europe, especially Germany. And they came to the United States, I believe New York, and they were turned away. 100,000, like the United States turned away something like 100,000, I believe, Jewish refugees. The country that took in the most Jews in the Western Hemisphere was Panama. So for the United States, many of these immigration laws were actually directed against Jewish people. So,
right.
And you start to see that. And so in World War II, the United States post facto claimed this was a war about the Holocaust and to preserve human rights and to create a body of human rights laws and things like that. The States didn't. The United States was anti-Semitic as anybody. They didn't reach out to help refugees.
It's really important to know that how many people were trying to flee Europe from Hitler and from the Holocaust and were turned away by the U.S. Many of them went to like South American countries and Central American countries, and that's why there's Jewish diasporas there. But it's really important to note that the hotbed of freedom and democracy and diversity and acceptance, like still turning people away from concentration camps. Who were trying to flee concentration camps.
And immigration's always had a political meaning, right? Today, you've got Trump wants to ban everybody, but he's offering, I don't know, like a Homestead Act to white South Africans or something like that, right?
They are oppressed, Bob.
Yeah.
So talking about repression, white South African farmers.
I like Elon Musk, right? That poor guy had to leave the country because as a white man, he didn't have a chance. He never was going to get a fair shot, right? White guys, most victimized group in South Africa. And that, of course, then I think the key part of this, which most of us are most familiar with this period, like World War II and after, right? And we could spend hours talking about this, and it's really fascinating. But you have McCarthyism. As a result of the Cold War, you got McCarthyism, the development of a national security state, all kinds of surveillance, the period of the Rosenbergs, the so-called spy hysteria, Hollywood blacklist, and all that. So you see repression's really ramping up. And the idea here now is that we now have this threat out there, the Soviet Union, that is so huge and so great, so evil, and they're intent on taking over the entire world. They want to enslave the entire world. But as America, we're the only country that can actually save the free world, right? That becomes the rhetoric. And based on that, you have McCarthyism. I have 258 names, and pretty soon you're having government hearings and you're blaming people and you're attacking people. You're putting Hollywood screenwriters in jail, Dalton Trumbo and Ring Lardner, Pete Seeger was hauled before these government agencies like HUAC, right? And
I think Pete Seeger did time too.
I think he was about to go in and then something happened. I don't think he actually did go to jail, but he was sentenced. But I could be wrong about that. But yeah, so this repression really takes on. And this is also the period when some of the laws we're seeing today being used were crafted, right? The one that we've heard about quite a bit lately is the McCarran Act of 1950, which is connected to the Immigration Act of 1952, the internal security, notice the word internal security, pretty much most countries have, it's a Department of the Interior. In the US, the Department of the Interior, is that still around, or has Trump got rid of that yet too?
We still have, I think,
Okay.
we still got.
Is it going to give it away?
They're going to use the Department of Interior to cut down the remaining forests of the.
I was just going to say, are they going to give it the Weyerhaeuser? Yeah.
They're going to give, exactly. Weyerhaeuser and some of those fracking companies.
But the Department of the Interior usually is the internal security apparatus, right? We have that. We have a Department of the Interior. We just don't call it that, right? Because that would be too crude and too like Prussian or something, right? But McCarran Internal Security Act was aimed at critics of the Cold War, the Korean War, and so forth. And actually, to his credit, Harry Truman did veto it, though it was overturned over McCarran. Actually, Senator Pat McCarran is from Nevada. I don't know if this is true. It's probably not. I don't think I've ever been told this. I just thought in my head. I wonder if that's the basis for Pat Geary in The Godfather.
I thought that too.
Yeah, I often wondered if McGarry was based on McCarran, because he's pretty similar. It can't be just like, it's got to be to some degree. It's got to be. But anyways, it's just like Pat Geary, the senator from Nevada in Godfather 2, tries to shake down Michael and gets his comeback for that, right? Yeah. But the McCarran Act required communist organizations to register with the government. I believe at the same time, the Smith Act actually banned the Communist Party. The Supreme Court later ruled that individual communists did not have to register with the government, but the Communist Party did, right? The McCarran Act made it a felony to contribute to a totalitarian dictatorship in the United States. Not sure how that worked out, right? And it also, and this is important, it authorized the president in an emergency, which the president can declare, to arrest and detain people who he believed might engage in espionage or sabotage. And I suspect it's some variant. I'm a lawyer, pretend to be one. I'm assuming it's some variant of this being applied right now, right? With Mahmoud Khalil and others, right? And this appeared like, the Rosenbergs were actually executed. Rosenbergs were U.S. citizens too. They were accused of, not of treason though, but of what was it, conspiracy, right, against the United States.
They got the death penalty. And wait, who was it who prosecuted them where they got the death penalty?
The most liberal Supreme Court Chief Justice of all time, Warren.
But Roy Cohn, who was Trump's mentor, also played a role in that as well.
Oh, yeah. But Warren was oh no, never mind. I'm wrong. I'm thinking of Earl Warren was the governor of California during the Japanese concentration camp era. So my bad.
Yeah. Roy Cohn was one of the prosecutors of the Rosenbergs, though.
Remember,
proudly got them the death penalty.
When the shit between Trump and Michael Cohen broke with, that wasn't Stormy, that was the other guy. But anyway, whatever. What was Cohen? Cohen was his fixer, right?
Yeah.
But at one point, the media said Trump was furious. He hates Cohen. He said, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" In the history of the United States, he's really far up there in the most odious, slithery, disgusting, horrible pieces of garbage, right? And this guy Trump emulates, right? So, but yeah, and the Cold War era is well known. The National Security Act creates a national security state, which now says primarily the role of the government is to preserve security, which means keeping you safe. And in order to keep you safe, we're going to have to get rid of teachers. We're going to have to get rid of ministers. We're going to get rid of Hollywood actors. It's just like how they go after Paul Robeson. One of the famous Supreme Court cases actually involved a communist historian, Herbert Afton, who was being denied a passport, and he went to the Supreme Court finally, right? So there's this repression, and the communist is great throughout. Trump's still calling the radical left and Marxist and all that shit, even though it doesn't exist, right? There was never a communist threat in the United States. Never, ever. There was never a Soviet threat in the United States. Never, ever. So every time the United States said, we have to protect you from this threat, everybody knew they were lying. Everybody knew there weren't threats, right? Somebody wasn't going to come in and take over the United States or anything like that. And there weren't enough communists in the United States. There's an old joke that, the Communist Party at one point, when the FBI and the government realized it really wasn't a threat, that they because they had people infiltrating. And so once the infiltrators left, there was nobody left in the Communist Party. By the 50s, it was mostly just FBI guys and stuff like that.
There is one point that we've talked about many times I want to bring up around this period, which is the liberal complicity in some of the purges during the Red Scare. And people who were radical and communists in the union movement, they weren't necessarily purged by McCarthy. They were purged by liberal union bosses, and liberal college or radical college professors were not purged by McCarthy. They were purged by liberal university administrators, which echoes very true today.
Yeah. Granted, Mahmoud Khalil is an extreme case, right? But most of these, they've been internal. You have Columbia University is on a freaking crusade. They didn't fire the head of the grad student union. I believe it's the grad student union. They
He
can't
was
fire
expelled.
him.
He was expelled.
He was expelled as a student or as
Yeah.
a faculty. I forget, it was an adjunct or whatever, but he was expelled. And how do you revoke a degree? Like, how do you revoke somebody's degree outside of plagiarism, right? How do you do that? Like, Columbia ain't cheap. What did these people pay in tuition? And they get their degree revoked because they criticize Israel. That's surreal.
It's like a dozen students, right?
Oh,
Something like that.
And plus how many were suspended, how many were arrested. That was all internal. That wasn't clearly Biden and Hochul and all of those Democrats, as well as Adams and all of them. Yeah, they clearly, Gavin Newsom, all of them greased the skids for it. Absolutely. But the heavy lifting was done internally. And this is the same as in the McCarthy era, right? I go back later on, we'll talk about COINTELPRO, but I keep thinking of the famous Stott Lynn episode where Stott went to visit Vietnam with Dave Dellinger and Tom Hayden, and then came back, and Yale got rid of him. He was obviously a brilliant scholar. I don't think he was tenured. That they told him basically, you're not getting tenured. You might as well get out of here, right? Again, that was Yale doing that.
Yeah.
And that's important. Now, we're not seeing the union get rid of people, but they're not taking a vigorous stand either. Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters president, is just absolutely, utterly useless. And even Sean Fain, who sometimes talks a good game, says he's in favor of tariffs because it's going to help labor. And so he's being silent on. Right now, these people Trump are getting rid of, a lot of them are union people, and they're all working people. And just because you're like the steel workers, the auto workers, or whatever, SEIU, it doesn't mean you can only talk about your workers. You talk about all workers, right? If Fain wants to talk about a national strike, then he should be freaking defending federal workers right now and AFG and all these other chaps.
Yeah, totally.
And that's also important. And like unions get caught in the crosshairs too. So if you look at something like the general strikes of 1919 or the Battle of Blair Mountain, which occurs right after World War I and is connected to that, you can see again, or Taft-Hartley after World War II, that these kind of national security demands morph into anti-labor laws and anti-labor attitudes. You don't want to come right out and say, we hate workers. So you say workers are more inclined to become Bolsheviks. Workers are more inclined to be radicals. Look at those CIO people. They're a bunch of communists and stuff like that. So it's connected to an attack on labor as well. And we could spend the whole time talking about the war and McCarthyism. We're all well of that. And as we pointed out many times, in the Senate, who was maybe McCarthy's biggest supporter and friend at the time.
John F. Kennedy,
little junior senator from Massachusetts. I guess he was the junior
Robert F. Kennedy was on staff or on his committee.
Yeah. Yeah. And then this is really kind of part of, there's this famous H. Rap Brown, I think it was said, violence is as American as cherry pie. And it was in the context of something like this, some form of repression. And that's, I think, important to understand, like what we're seeing today, right? We've seen historically, traditionally, during the Vietnam era, obviously you had Operation COINTELPRO, which merges civil rights, surveillance against civil rights with these mostly anti-war groups, which kind of emerge, right? Like SDS and the Black Panthers and others. And there's infiltrators, they're going after people, arresting people.
But there's also an element where they have people infiltrate and then they set up leaders within the movements. And they go after civil rights, and then they also go after like new left groups and anti-war groups. And then what I would say are like groups in the US, which are like related to like more national liberation struggles, like the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement.
Yeah.
But then they set up their leaders, particularly with AIM and the Panthers, to be killed by other members of their group. Or in the case of Fred Hampton, which we have a fantastic show on from a few years back, is that the Chicago police worked with the FBI and the COINTEL operation to assassinate Fred Hampton, and Mark Clark, I believe was his bodyguard's name, right? And with an infiltrator drugging him and setting him up. And not only are they like infiltrating, watching, but they're also really agitating and disrupting these groups from the inside, which is completely illegal.
Yeah. And COINTELPRO was obviously enormous, right? They're, like the Black Panthers and SDS and other groups, AIM, the Brown Berets were targeted in particular, but it really did impact everybody. Not as much as today, but they did go to college campuses. They worked with, like we've talked before, like in Columbia in 1968, students like went in there and occupied the dean's office. Like they put their feet up on his desk, smoked his cigars, and it took a week for Columbia to send the police in, right? And I don't think anybody had degrees revoked or anything like that back then. So what we're seeing today in many ways is actually, I think, more ominous than even that. And that kind of creates, after that, it just becomes hard. So you see this used all the time, like in you know this better than anybody, like the environmental movement becomes targeted now as part of this like government effort to weed out all these subversive people, right?
Right.
So the Red Scare really never dies.
No, it shifts focus, right? And so the Red Scare, COINTELPRO, I don't remember the exact date that they started. COINTELPRO was in the 50s, right? And
Yeah, I think so.
And they started looking at radical groups. They started looking at communists. They started looking at civil rights groups. It gets exposed in the early 70s after some anti-war activists actually burglarized an FBI office in suburban Philly. The radicals who were being targeted knew that they were being disrupted and attacked by the state. They didn't know how well and organized an effort it was. And it turns out to be this counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. And then it gets exposed. And that's what leads to things like the Frank Church Committee and all of that, which really like lifts up what our government, what the FBI and the CIA had been doing both domestically and abroad. It's an important period where a lot of this gets exposed in the early mid 70s.
There's also a period like our friend Will Potter has written about like really powerfully. This is when you start to see that, right? Where the Red Scare becomes
the Green Scare.
Yeah.
So I think that the sort of like a bridge period is COINTELPRO gets exposed. In the 80s, we still have a lot of radical movements. We have Central America Solidarity.
Which was infiltrated. There was like a big part of the Central American movement was these Christian Catholic radicals, Catholic pacifists, and they were infiltrated. That kind of liberation theology movement was deeply infiltrated in the U.S., right?
Right. The American Friends Service Committee, which was actually really active in that, was deeply infiltrated. And so
Pledge of Resistance.
Yep. The Central America Pledge of Resistance. But then we also see, this is also in the period, because we've done many episodes on this history, the rise of Earth First. And so we also see that Earth First becomes infiltrated as well. And there's like a lot of disruption there. An old Earth Firster once told me that they had a camp in the late 80s. And there was this guy who came who actually couldn't be a mechanic. And they were all excited about him being there because he could teach them how to dismantle a bulldozer. Turns out he was an FBI infiltrator.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stories within the radical environmental movement in the 80s and 90s about how they were targeted by the feds, both in prosecutions and with infiltration. But that leads to the Green Scare, which is more of a late 90s into the 2000s sort of phenomenon.
Especially after 9/11, right? Where everything is terroristic.
Yeah. And we've had shows with Will Potter, who's a journalist who's covered this. We've had shows with at least two people who were jailed because of the Green Scare, which is Jake Conroy, who was with the Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty campaign, and Daniel McGowan, who was a member of the Earth Liberation Front. And this is pretty well documented. And so there's where they went after people and prosecuted them. And it had this terrible chilling effect too, which is also, I think, the point of a lot of this state repression is that it doesn't just want to jail people. It just wants to scare people into staying home and not talking back.
Exactly. Like I said, deporting 6,000 people is not like statistically meaningful, but it says to everybody, I better be careful what I say. Yeah, I better be careful talking to my neighbor. We'll talk about 911 in a minute, so go ahead. But I think that's really crucial because the environmental movement, I think, ends up really in the crosshairs.
Yeah, and I think the environmental movement is like definitely in the radical environmentalism, radical environmental movement, and actually the radical animal rights movement. I think we're like somewhat neutralized by what happens with the Green Scare. Definitely, those are both still like vibrant movements doing things, and in the environment, on the environmental side, it's definitely much more around climate now. And don't get me wrong, because the climate movement also gets targeted, and probably will be increasingly targeted even more at this point, because it threatens one of the pillars of the American economy and one of the pillars of people who receive large amounts of money, which is the fossil fuel sector. And there's a lot of state repression going on. We see a lot of laws passed targeting anti-pipeline protesters after Standing Rock. We see a lot of more civil litigation and civil RICO suits, racketeering suits against environmental protesters. We're also now beginning to see an increase in uptick in state prosecutions against these groups as well. Like for example, Cop City, 50 or 60 people have actually gotten a criminal RICO chart filed against them. And so it's just it's an important process where we've seen going back with COINTELPRO, going back to Red Scare of the 50s and the 20s and things like that. We actually also see a lot of private entities engaging in this stuff too. There's a lot of private security contractors out there which do what COINTELPRO did. There's where oil companies are suing people because they don't feel like there's been enough prosecution against individuals and organizations.
Oil companies are paying police to go out in the streets and hassle protesters and things like that.
Maybe in Houston, Texas, the oil companies even sponsor police horses to go and trample on protesters.
Yeah, they all have
true story.
They all have a different oil company logo on their hindquarters.
Yeah. But they do actually.
We don't have enough time to go into depth, but like 911 is really critical to this and really bringing these things to a new level, because in the immediate aftermath, you get the Patriot Act and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and TSA, warrantless searches courtesy of Barack Hussein Obama and others, right? Outright torture and like at Gitmo and Abu Ghraib becomes like this period when there is really hardcore repression. This is when, because of social media, you start to see more and more stories, and even sometimes not like you get today where it's constant, the videos, but even back then you would get the stories and sometimes video about like government agents going to somebody's house because they said something on social media or whatever, right? So it becomes really, really repressive at that point. It really ramps up. And this is when you get things like the terror enhancement laws for like animal rights or environmentalism or whatever, right? And that kind of brings us up to the current situation. And I think, and I've been playing with this and I'm still not really sure how much I think about it, but I think that what we're seeing today, especially with regard to this kind of use of anti-Semitism, these attacks on people who are criticizing the genocide that Israel is committing, I think that's really directly connected to what we saw in 2020 when COVID broke out. Because what we saw there was bizarre, where you started to have these, especially these southern states, these Republican-controlled states, like go after people in ways that I hadn't seen before. So obviously there's these huge controversies over whether you should wear a mask or whether you should get vaccinated. And you have these scenes from like the Michigan State House where these guys are coming in there with AR-15s and screaming in the faces of cops. If that had been like a black kid in the street, they would have been dead. And I think that really changed, because then you started to see, especially in these conservative places, they flipped it and they started making laws that you're not allowed to wear a mask and you're not allowed to question this. And that really just erupts into this insanity. I think COVID is huge, right? This is connected. Obviously, there have been book bans way before COVID. There have been all this stuff way before COVID, anti-DEI, anti-CETA. That's all existed way before COVID. I get it. But I think COVID gave so much oxygen and momentum to these forces that when these other issues like Israel especially came up, I think Americans were already like being trained to think repressively. COVID, I think, was a big deal too. And we're still seeing that, right? Where the government bans certain types of information. And again, this is something we haven't really mentioned. I think because we assume people should know this is bipartisan too. This isn't Democrat versus Republican thing, right?
No. But if you listen to liberal Twitter or whatever, that it's only the Republicans who do this. So,
Yes.
How, pre-January 20th, 2025, all these people who were telling us that we're a problem because we're criticizing Biden over Gaza are now all so concerned about the children of Gaza. And I think you're right on. Just as the bigger theme, I do think that COVID has really scrambled American politics in ways that we don't understand yet. And I think that's the sort of, I think that's one of the main themes here as we're moving into this more repressive sort of era.
Yeah. So the stuff, if you know this, if you're aware of this, then you're not shocked, that would be the word, by what's happening today. It's outrageous. It's horrible. It's scary. But this is America, and it's done by everybody, right? Wilson was a Democrat. FDR, Japanese concentration camps, was a Democrat. Harry Truman was a Democrat. The Cold War. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were in COINTELPRO. Kennedy sent the Justice Department after Martin Luther King. Clinton and Obama contributed to this culture, this national security surveillance state. And that's not shocking. So we're here today. I think the power of propaganda. I think if Bernays was around in the Committee on Public Information, I think they'd be stunned at how powerful and how effective the media goes along with this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
And obviously what's happened in New York at Columbia University is horrifying. It's terrible. And to me, what happened that's not really that unique. And I don't know the law. I've read lawyers who said essentially the government can do that, which based on my non-legal reading of it sounds about right because the government always has done that. And so we're in a bad way. If you look at some of the people who were caught up in like the first Red Scare or the Cold War, it's bad. And in some ways, we're not seeing stuff today like we did then. Paul Robeson was a U.S. citizen who had his passport denied, right? That kind of stuff. But we got a long way to go. And there's no reason to think things are going to suddenly get better. I think what like the Mahmoud.
We're approaching the end of month 2 at this point.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, and nobody wants to say it, but if the courts say Mahmoud Khalil is not allowed to be deported, you have to release him. What if Trump says no? What if he doesn't? What if he puts him on a plane and sends him to Syria for rendition? What happens then? Does anybody stop him? Chuck Schumer?
AOC
AOC is going to stop
strongly worded tweet.
A strongly worded tweet. Once she gets all the right information.
Yeah.
Rashida Tlaib circulated a letter condemning the government for what they did. And there are 100 members of the Progressive Caucus in the House. 14 signed it. Only 14 out of 100. These are the progressives signed it. AOC did because she said, I needed to get more information beforehand. What do you need information for? It's like a
weak sauce is what that is.
Yeah. So here we are. And I know you personally have been on the receiving end of this. I've been hassled, but nothing like what you've gone through. I think the fear for a lot of us is that this is going to just continue, especially people who are doing Palestine work are going to be at the very front line of all this. But I'm not sure anybody who's out there doing anything anymore is really all that. Say, look at Don Zinger, people like that. What happened to Steven Zonzinger?
Yeah. And I want to talk about what happened this week too, which is the sort of new crony who's using his influence with Trump and within being in high level government circles to his own benefit, right? We probably should have a whole show about how Elon Musk is profiting off of Doge and being involved with the Trump administration. But a couple of weeks ago, I did an interview for Green and Red with Valerie Costa, who has been involved with the Takedown Tesla movement. And over the weekend, some troll who has 1 million Twitter followers basically went into a very in-depth description of Valerie and why she was a criminal because she was like organizing all these protests, which are peaceful, nonviolent, stand on the sidewalk and hold signed protests for the most part against Tesla. Tesla has lost something like 20% of its market value. Musk has lost a lot of wealth between the Tesla takedown and the stock market crash. And this troll tweeted this attack on Valerie and actually had a clip from our interview. So Green and Red was actually on this troll's tweet. And then Elon retweeted it to his 50 million followers. And we haven't actually really received any backlash at all with Green and Red, but Valerie got a lot of backlash. She got death threats, she got emails, and she's been fighting back in the last couple of days and putting this stuff. She had an editorial in The Guardian, and she's been doing a bunch of media. And so she's fighting back against them trying to terrorize her. But I think this is also like a piece of it too, which is that it's really easy for people like Musk and these other trolls to just like whip up a lot of like crazies to like come after you, at least digitally, if not in person. Like thankfully there's been no in-person incidents as far as we know. But I just want to say that this is also like a new piece, and it's actually led to Trump the next day come out and, he bought himself a Tesla. And while he was doing this infomercial for Tesla on the White House lawn, he actually said that he was going to do something about the Takedown Tesla movement because they were domestic terrorists. And so I've also, this week, as we've seen with the Mahmoud Khalil and the Takedown Tesla movement, we've been really seeing a lot of rhetoric and noise coming from the right about how protesters are criminals. I actually saw a clip with Tommy Tuberville, that genius senator from this great state of Alabama, who's going to run for governor, by the way, talking about how all protesters should just be in jail. And so there's a lot of really disturbing sort of rhetoric coming from the right. I know it's existed for a long time. It seems like they have a lot more of a bully pulpit than they did previously.
And like the scary part is like a couple of weeks ago, I saw stronger condemnations of this from Ann Coulter and Candace Owen than I did from anybody like in the leadership of the Democratic Party outside of Rashida Tlaib and I don't know, the usual suspects. Even there were like even these like Candace Owen and Ann Coulter said this is insane.
It's unconstitutional. Ann Coulter said, I don't like protesters, but
Yeah,
this actually goes against the Constitution.
yeah, yeah. And they're not now. You're banning media outlets. It's bad. There's no way.
Laura
bad.
Loomer actually has also spoken out on this stuff too. There's there's a number of new initiatives that the government is doing to crack down on dissent.
Yeah.
They actually see the nonprofit complex as actually a bastion of dissent. So there's a bill in Congress called the NGO Killer Bill. I think it's HR 9495. It's specifically targeting Palestinian solidarity and Palestinian rights organizations if they're involved in criminal activities or terrorist activities, and they can just, if Trump passes it, then he'll have the ability to just in nonprofit C3 statuses. So that's one thing. And if he does that, they're doing that under the auspices of this sort of like anti-Palestine crusade that they're on. But they can do that to anybody. They could do that to the Sierra Club if they wanted to.
And then the votes and stuff they've had on this so far, Democrats have broken ranks too. So it's
the Democrats are totally on board with this.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to note is that Trump just signed another, I think it was an executive order where that any students who are actually in debt forgiveness programs actually can't get student debt forgiveness if they work for these criminal nonprofits. So they just passed that. And then the other one, there was the Consumer Protection Finance Bureau, which I believe was started at the behest of Elizabeth Warren. So it's like, goes back to like maybe the Obama era. They had actually passed rules on what they call unbanking. And so with unbanking, previous to that, banks could actually not provide services to people if they disagreed with their politics or their ideology. This is something that Laura Loomer was targeted on. This is something she spoke out against. So if you have politics, and mostly think about this for Palestinians and people who are fighting in the genocide in Gaza, is that if a Zionist group targets you, and one of the things they can do is dox you with your bank, and then your bank can just close your account. And so that's also, unbanking is actually a very troubling sort of move that we've now seen. Laura Loomer has actually been unbanked, like whatever. She's a white nationalist piece of shit, but still, like, I think it's important that not being able to use PayPal, Venmo, bank accounts, things like that, or that's going to have a big impact on people's lives.
A few years ago, a guy I knew he bought something something involved with Russia, apolitical, like not all, but his PayPal was suspended because he bought something that had some connection to Russia. Let's call him. And also, you mentioned doxing. We have doxing being done, like in DC, like Trump's appointees as like federal marshals and attorneys are threatening doxing people and telling law firms not to hire them. You have these really disgusting, horrible, odious garbage men like Bill Ackman and Robert Kraft at Harvard and Columbia. They're attacking students. They're doxing students. You have professors like Shai Davide at Columbia. He's probably behind most of this. He is such a repugnant, garbage, subhuman, right? And Davide is like going after, he's trying to get his own students killed. I'm a professor. I have conservative students, and I disagree with it. I don't want to get him in trouble. I don't even want him to fail. Who tries to get his own students thrown in jail and probably murdered?
He was the one behind Mahmoud Khalil's detention.
Oh yeah. And he's banned from campus because he's so fucking incendiary and dangerous himself.
Yeah.
But he can continue to do that.
Yeah.
Right? It's a bad way. But I think the important part, and I always do, I think a lot of lefties know their history. That's great. I'm not sure how much it matters anymore, but I still got to believe that it's important to get this out there to understand what we're dealing with. This is not new or unique, obviously. It's a very traditional, very powerful tradition in the U.S. It's an age-old tactic used by the ruling class to instill people with fear and intimidation, so they don't question what you're doing by going after marginal groups. And it's like Rob Brown said, this kind of repression is as American as cherry pie.
Yep, exactly. I do want to say, because we're seeing these people at high levels of these institutions who we thought were on our side, mostly thinking about the Democratic Party and people within the media, but I'm sure I could probably expand that list if we wanted to go into that. But while I have no faith and I'm not even disappointed, I'm just disgusted because of what they do. I do want to say that I am inspired that so many people are on the street pushing back on this. Yeah. After Valerie's attack by Musk, the number of Takedown Tesla actions has increased exponentially. There's 95 scheduled for this weekend, right? Which is I think the biggest number that they've had. And so and the response to Mahmoud Khalil's detention from people all over the world really is also very inspiring. And so the thing about it is that Trump and Musk are not invincible and they're not inevitable. They do have a lot of power. They have a lot of wealth, but the more we push back every little thing we can do to, resist and sabotage and fight back is what is required in this moment.
Yeah. And I think, like a lot of these are, I wouldn't say they're spontaneous, but they're emerging, right? Because people are pissed off and they're emerging, and this is important, they're emerging without any central direction from like the Democrats or whoever, which kind of shows we don't need them. They're in the way. Everything that we've been saying many of us have been saying for decades, really, and it's come true, right? What Schumer did, right? They punch left. They'll go after their left wing. They're scolding people for wearing pink at the fucking State of the Union address. The Democratic leadership is upset. They're mad at Al Green. 10 Democrats voted to censure Al Green. Nothing ever happened to Boebert or what's the other clown's name right now? So
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're not going to get central direction. And I think that's great. I think that's like more and more people are doing stuff. Groups like Jewish Voice for Peace is incredible. They're inspiring. These students all over campuses. Sean Fain somebody needs to smack him upside the head and wake him up and get him out there. But there's stuff going on. And the other thing about Trump, he's a fucking idiot. He is. He's insane. He's dangerous. He's just a wild ape in the freaking circus, just throwing his shit everywhere and trying to escape and smacking people around. But he also, how many different positions has he already taken on tariffs? Courts are telling him he needs to rehire people. He can be stood up to. This guy was like, he only won with under 50% of the vote. And if you look at the data now, he's not popular. The shitty thing, Elon Musk is hated. The only thing less popular than Elon Musk are like the Democratic Party. So
I will also say that Trump has, been a hell of a good thing for the Canadian Liberal Party and the European moderates and Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico.
Yeah.
They're all like the liberals in Canada have made a comeback where they were probably going to get trounced in their next election. And the European moderates, I know that the AfD or whatever they were had like a pretty good turnout in Germany, but it seems Trump's doing a little bit of what he did in the first term, which is he's been a really good organizer for a global resistance to the oligarchy or authoritarianism or whatever you want to call it.
He's a grifter and everything. Like his only ideology is to steal as much as he can.
Yeah.
This isn't about like America. It's just about Trump and Musk. It's about a few things, but he's obviously not a fucking genius. They rule with raw, naked power and no one is standing up to them. And that has to stop. Look at like yesterday, that was very powerful at Trump Tower. So that's got to continue.
Yep.
But the state is not your friend. The state is your enemy. There occasionally are decent people there, but for the most part, we're on our own. And the kind of stuff like Tesla is awesome. What's going on there is really fantastic, right?
Yeah.
Anyway,
well, let's wrap it there. We've been on for a bit now.
An hour, yeah. Good history lesson.
Folks, you've been getting a nice little history lesson on state repression from the Green and Red podcast. If you like us, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to this on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. If you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And we will talk to you all again soon. And now more than ever, make trouble and misbehave. And we'll talk to you again really soon.
Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?